we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. We are recording this episode of Multipolarity on Tuesday, the 4th of November, and news has recently broken that the former Vice President of the United States, Richard Bruce Cheney, better known as Dick, has passed away today at the age of 84. Dick Cheney was the most powerful vice president in recent times by quite a long way, I think it's fair to say. More importantly than that is what he symbolizes, and I think his death coming the same week that the United States and China agreed to a trade deal, which is essentially a truce and essentially involves the US backing down, and especially involves Donald Trump backing down. I think it's very symbolic that Dick Cheney died today or this week at this moment. Dick Cheney was a true believer in neoconservatism and the project for the new American century. And as somebody with extensive and impeccable ties inside the Beltway and with an extremely deep understanding of the way that things worked on Capitol Hill, he was one of the people who enabled that neoconservative project to have so much influence and achieve so many of its aims. At the same time, he also, for anybody who's read The Dark Side by the journalist Jane Meyer, was important in pushing the idea that the tragedy of 9/11 should be used as an opportunity to roll back some of the restrictions on the office of the President of the United States that had been put in place toward the end of the Nixon regime as a response to some of President Richard Nixon's personal foibles, but ultimately the Watergate scandal. So both in pushing forward the progress of the so-called imperial presidency and concentrating greater powers within the executive branch of government, but also in terms of pushing the neoconservative project forward and really achieving a great many of their aims. Richard Cheney was hugely important in deciding and molding what America would do with the unipolar moment. And ultimately, he was important in massively accelerating the end of that unipolar period. And this week, in the week that Dick Cheney died, we've had that most imperial of imperial presidents, Donald J. Trump, backing down in the face of superior Chinese economic might. The first time that the US has backed down in any economic contest, I would say, for more than 100 years. It's the moment when I think it's impossible for anybody to claim that we still live in a unipolar world. The world is now firmly multipolar because simply the US wouldn't have backed down in this manner if it was still unipolar. It just wouldn't have happened. When does the US back down for anything? I'm not saying that this has been a humiliating defeat. It's more of a truce. The two sides have essentially backed away from their various escalations. We're back now to something like the state that we had in after the Liberation Day tariffs. The Chinese tariff rate is about 30% on goods. That compares with about 10% for the EU, or a little bit more than 10% for the EU, and somewhere between 0 and 10% effectively for Mexico and Canada. But back down, the US has in a minor way. They've called a truce. Now they have a year to put things right. Whether they'll be able to do that, I don't know, because this truce expires within a year. The Chinese have agreed to relent on their rare earth metals restrictions and to buy some US soybeans. as a kind of as an exchange for the US backing off on the tariffs, but that the US have really had to withdraw from their position of very high tariffs on China, and they've also had to withdraw from some of their technology restrictions, shows that really China has got the better end of this deal. And as I say, it's it's in the very week that Richard Cheney has passed away. Philip, what is your initial reading on the situation with the trade deal?
I think this is the signal. This is when people wake up to the fact that multipolarities are here. Basically, I mean, it's been here for a long time, but the actual import of that. This trade situation doesn't show some sort of a de-escalation of tensions or whatever the Western press are saying. It shows that the American economy is subordinate to the Chinese economy, quite subordinate. It is the second economy in the world. In terms of trade, it's probably the third economy in the world. The European Union is more important in terms of trade than the United States by a long shot, I'd argue. China is a more important economy than the US. If there's brinkmanship between the two, the Chinese control what you might call the escalation ladder. The Americans can try to escalate, but they're forced to de-escalate. This is how people think in terms of conflict, and I don't think it's completely misleading to think of a trade war in the same way.
Philip, can I just interrupt you a little bit? I'm sorry to make the first interruption after only like 6 minutes or something, but look, we've spoken on Multipolarity before about how the Chinese economy is a little bit is dominant. I don't mean it's dominant in the way that the US economy is over, Mexico, for example, but still the balance of power now has shifted slightly in the Chinese favor. But why should that necessarily matter in terms of trade disputes? Because history, like I know that you've made the argument before that it's much easier to replace the money that you receive from customers than it is to replace the actual goods that you receive themselves. Therefore, the balance of power lies with China. But it is the case, is it not? Like I read some economists on Twitter, like Brad, is it Setzer or Seltzer, who argues that history shows pretty clearly that in trade disputes, it's the surplus country that loses out most. It's the country with the trade surplus. So, for instance, during the Great Depression, it was France and Japan and the United States and Germany that suffered the most, and countries like Britain, who had a trade deficit, actually suffered far less from the Great Depression. So, while it does make sense that the country that has the more important economy, which is China, and the country that only has to replace money rather than the actual goods that they receive, some of which are tremendously important, which is also China, would have the advantage. How does that match with history, where, in trade disputes in the past, it does seem to have been the surplus countries that really suffered the harshest of depressions?
I'd be very suspicious of those readings of Depression-era protectionist policies. I'm not personally in favor of these types of policies, but just, if you're going back to the 1930s and you're picking through old statistics, I mean, I did it back in my college days, I suppose. I don't think they're very credible, let's just put it that way. So I wouldn't put much stock in those kind of old historical arguments. I mean, look, we've had a test of trade war now since, what, April? April was Liberation Day, so that's almost half a year. No, it's more than half a year. It's 7 months, right? And what's happened? The Americans came out and claimed to blow up the world, and all they seemed to blow up was the dollar and the gold price. I mean, that's all that really happened. I just don't think America's that important of an economy. I think that's what we're coming to realize. I'm not saying it's an unimportant economy, but it's mainly a demand sink, as in it sucks goods in and sends dollars out. And the dollar has been tanking since April, and gold's been rising, and interest rates are high in the US. I think Liberation Day just began to demolish the Wall Street model. Obviously, it's still intact. It'll probably remain intact until this AI bubble bursts. I think that'll be its last round.
Hello there, this is Andy Collingwood. Here at Multipolarity, we work every week to bring you the freshest thinking in geopolitics. In order to do that, we reserve 1/4 of our episodes, so that's 1 episode in 4, and make those exclusively available to people who make this show possible, our subscribers. Previously, that's a benefit we've only made available on Patreon. But as our YouTube audience has grown, we've decided to let listeners subscribe directly on that platform too, via the memberships option. Simply click the join button and select our first tier, Palmerston, Basic Gunboat Diplomacy. Doing so will give you not only access to the new premium episodes, but access to our war chest of over 25 previous premium episodes too. And as a YouTube exclusive, you can also get access to our occasional Multipolarity Dialogues episodes 1 week early if you subscribe to the higher Metanic tier. So what have you got to lose? For less than the price of a beer in a pub, at least in London, much less, you can have 1/3 more multipolarity in your life. That's not just common sense, it's maths. Okay, bye for now. See you on the other side of the paywall.
We say to people that if you're European and you go over to America, everything's kind of crappy. I know that sounds kind of mean. I'm not trying to be mean, but I used to live in America. I lived in America twice. And the first